Clean that up, maid. Those 3 words, spoken in front of my entire family, at what I thought would be a peaceful Sunday dinner, changed everything. My daughter-in-law. Jessica's voice dripped with such contempt as she gestured toward the wine glass she'd just knocked over onto my grandmother's Persian rug. The red liquid spread like blood across the cream-colored threads, and for a moment, I wondered if this was what betrayal actually looked like. 22 people sat around my dining room table that evening, including my son David, my other children, their spouses, and 7 grandchildren. Every single one of them heard her call me the help in my own home. But here's what Jessica didn't know, as she smirked and waited for me to scramble for paper towels. Here's what none of them knew as they sat there in uncomfortable silence, forks halfway to their mouths. The house she was treating me like a servant in. I owned it. Every brick, every beam, every square inch of the 4,000 square foot colonial that my son and his wife had been living in rent-free for 3 years, and I had the deed in my bedroom safe to prove it. The smell of roast beef still hung in the air when I made my decision. I set down my napkin, looked Jessica straight in her perfectly made-up face, and said words that would shatter her world in less than 30 seconds. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how we got to that moment, how love can turn into manipulation so slowly you don't see it happening until you're being called hired help at your own dinner table. It started 3 years ago when David called me at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, his voice thick with tears I hadn't heard since he was 12 and his father left us. "Mom, we're going to lose the apartment," he whispered into the phone. "Jessica's pregnant, and I got laid off last week. The landlord wants us out by Friday." My heart broke for him, for them, for the grandchild I didn't even know was coming yet. I'd raised 4 children on my own, after their father disappeared with his 23-year-old secretary, and our life savings, working double shifts as a nurse to keep our heads above water. I knew what drowning felt like. "Move in here," I said without thinking. "You can have the guest wing until you get back on your feet." The words tumbled out before logic could stop them. David's relief was so palpable I could feel it through the phone line. "Mom, are you sure? We don't want to be a burden." But how could my child ever be a burden? How could the grandchild I'd been praying for be anything but a blessing? Jessica wasn't thrilled about the arrangement when they moved in that weekend. She walked through my home like she was touring a museum, touching my antiques with barely concealed disdain. "It's very traditional," she said, wrinkling her nose at the family photos lining the hallway. "I suppose we can make it work temporarily." Temporarily. That word should have been a warning sign, but I was too excited about having my son close again, too eager to welcome his wife into our family. The first month was actually pleasant. Jessica was in her 2nd trimester, dealing with morning sickness that lasted all day, so I helped however I could. I made her ginger tea, picked up her prenatal vitamins, drove her to doctor appointments when David was job hunting. I thought we were bonding. I thought I was being the mother-in-law I'd always wanted to have, but Jessica saw something different in my kindness. She saw a woman she could use. The requests started small. "Margaret, could you grab my sweater from upstairs? My back is killing me." "Margaret, would you mind making dinner tonight? I'm just so exhausted." "Margaret, the bathroom needs cleaning, and I can't be around harsh chemicals." I didn't mind helping. She was carrying my grandchild, living in a new place, dealing with pregnancy hormones. What kind of monster would I be if I said no? David found work after 6 weeks. A good job at a tech company in downtown Portland. I was so proud, watching him leave each morning in his new suit, his shoulders squared with purpose again. "This is temporary, Mom," he assured me every few days. "We'll find our own place soon." But Jessica had other plans. Plans that became clearer as her belly grew, and my role in their lives became more complicated. The nursery should be in the room, facing east, Jessica announced one morning over breakfast, her hand resting on her 6-month bump. "Better light for the baby." That room was my sewing room, where I'd spent countless evenings making quilts and mending clothes for my children when they were small. The walls were covered with family photos. My grandmother's sewing machine sat in the corner, and boxes of memory quilts filled the closet. "Of course," I heard myself saying, "I'll move my things this weekend." Moving out of that room felt like giving up a piece of my soul, but I told myself it was temporary, just until they found their own place, just until my son got back on his feet. I carried my grandmother's sewing machine to the basement myself, my arthritic hand struggling with the weight. Jessica watched from the doorway, one hand on her hip, the other on her belly. "You might want to paint before I start decorating," she said. That yellow is really outdated. The baby arrived on a snowy December morning, and everything changed again. Little Emma was perfect. 10 fingers and 10 toes and the most beautiful dark hair I'd ever seen. I fell in love the moment I held her, and I understood that feeling people talk about, that instant, fierce protectiveness that grandparents feel. I would have done anything for that baby, which Jessica seemed to understand better than I did. Margaret, could you take the night shift? I'm just so tired. Margaret, could you pick up diapers and formula and maybe grab some of those organic baby food pouches? Margaret, Emma's crying. Can you calm her down? You're better at it than me. I became a live-in babysitter, a housekeeper, a cook, an errand runner. I became the help without realizing it was happening. David worked long hours, eager to prove himself at the new job, often leaving before Emma woke up and coming home after she was asleep. He missed the subtle shift in household dynamics, the way Jessica stopped asking and started expecting. He didn't see how she'd started speaking to me like I was staff rather than family. Maybe he didn't want to see it. Margaret, this place is a mess, Jessica said one afternoon when Emma was 8 months old. I'd been up all night with the teething baby and had fallen asleep on the couch during Emma's afternoon nap. I woke up to find Jessica standing over me, her face twisted with disgust. I can't live like this. You need to do better. Do better. In my own home, in the house I'd been mortgage-free on for 12 years, in the space where I'd raised 4 children and buried my parents and celebrated every Christmas for the past 23 years. But I apologized anyway because I'd been trained to apologize, trained to accommodate, trained to put everyone else's comfort before my own dignity. The breaking point had been building for months, but I didn't recognize it until that Sunday dinner when Jessica's mask finally slipped completely. I'd spent all day cooking, preparing a feast for the family gathering I hosted every month. Roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, homemade dinner rolls, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. The table was set with my mother's good china, the chandelier dimmed to create a warm glow, and I'd even put fresh flowers in every room. My daughter Sarah had driven down from Seattle with her husband and 2 boys. My youngest son Mark brought his new girlfriend, a sweet girl named Amy who kept complimenting the decorations and asking about family recipes. My other daughter Lisa came with her husband and 3 children, including my youngest grandchild, 2-year-old Sophia, who kept calling me Gamma and giving me sticky-fingered hugs. The evening started beautifully. Everyone was talking and laughing. The children were playing between courses, and I felt that deep satisfaction that comes from bringing your family together around a table. This was what I lived for. These moments when everyone was fed and happy and connected. This was why I'd worked myself to exhaustion for 30 years. Jessica sat at my right side, bouncing Emma on her lap and accepting compliments on how well the baby was doing. She's such a good sleeper now, Jessica said, smiling at my daughter Sarah. Of course, having leave-in help makes everything easier. The way she said help made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling away. This was family time. I wouldn't let negativity spoil it. But then Jessica reached for the wine bottle, misjudged the distance, and knocked over her glass. The Merlot splashed across the table, soaking through the linen tablecloth I'd inherited from my grandmother, and dripping onto the Persian rug my parents had bought for my wedding 28 years ago. Everyone lunged for their plates and glasses, trying to prevent more damage. That's when Jessica looked directly at me and said, "Clean that up, maid." The words hit like a slap. 22 people went silent. My grandson Tyler, Sarah's 15-year-old, had his fork halfway to his mouth and just froze there. Little Sophia stopped chattering about her chicken nuggets. Even baby Emma seemed to sense the tension and went quiet in Jessica's arms. I stared at my daughter-in-law, waiting for her to realize what she'd said, waiting for an apology or at least some acknowledgement that she'd crossed a line. But Jessica just sat there, chin lifted, waiting for me to scramble for towels like the hired help she clearly thought I was. David cleared his throat. "Jess, maybe we should." "I'll get paper towels," Sarah said quickly, starting to rise from her chair. "No." The word came out harder than I intended, and everyone looked at me. "Stay seated, Sarah." I stood up slowly, my arthritis making my knees protest, and looked around the table at my family, my children, who I'd sacrificed everything for, my grandchildren, who I would die protecting, and Jessica, who was still waiting for me to clean up her mess in my own dining room. "Jessica," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "I need to show you something. Everyone, actually, I think there's been some confusion about whose house this is." I walked to the kitchen, pulled open the junk drawer where I kept important papers, and retrieved the folder I'd been meaning to organize for months. Inside was the deed to my house, clear and legal, and bearing my name alone. I'd paid off the mortgage 3 years early with the life insurance money from my mother, and I had the satisfaction note from the bank to prove it. When I returned to the dining room, the family was still sitting in uncomfortable silence. Jessica had her arms crossed over her chest, her foot tapping impatiently against her chair leg. She actually rolled her eyes when she saw me coming back with papers. "I don't know what game you're playing, Margaret, but this," I said, placing the deed in front of her plate, right next to the wine stain, "is the deed to this house, my house. The house you've been living in rent-free for 3 years while calling me the maid." Jessica's face went white. She picked up the document with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the legal language that clearly stated, "Margaret Helen Richardson as the sole owner of 2847 Maple Street." My son David leaned over to read it, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "Mom," he started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished," I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded. "Jessica, since you seem to think I work for you, let me clarify our arrangement. You don't pay rent, you don't pay utilities, you don't pay for groceries, or cable, or internet, or any of the other bills that keep this house running. What you do is live here for free while treating the owner like hired help." The silence stretched on until my daughter, Sarah, started to smile. Then Mark snorted, trying to hide a laugh. Even Lisa, who usually stayed out of family drama, was shaking her head in amazement. "Furthermore," I continued, picking up steam, "since you're so concerned about cleanliness, let me tell you who actually cleans this house. I clean your bathroom, I wash your dishes, I do your laundry, I vacuum the rooms you live in and dust the furniture you use. I cook your meals and buy your groceries and take care of your daughter when you're too tired or too busy or just don't feel like it." Emma started to fuss, and Jessica bounced her absently, still staring at the deed like she couldn't believe it was real. "So the next time you feel tempted to call me the maid," I said, leaning down so Jessica and I were eye level, "remember that maids get paid, they get days off, they get treated with basic human dignity, they also get to go home at the end of the day," which is something you might want to think about. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David was studying his hands, his face a mask of shame. Jessica's mouth was opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. My grandson Tyler broke the tension by starting to clap slowly. "Damn, Grandma," he said, earning a sharp look from Sarah. "That was cold language," Sarah corrected automatically, but she was grinning. The rest of dinner was awkward, but in a satisfying way. Jessica barely spoke, picking at her food while Emma babbled and played with her mashed potatoes. My other children and their families relaxed once they realized the drama was over, and conversation gradually returned to normal topics. Christmas plans, school activities, work promotions, the usual family updates. After everyone left, I found David standing in the kitchen, loading plates into the dishwasher with mechanical precision. Jessica had taken Emma upstairs immediately after the last guest left, claiming the baby needed a diaper change and a nap. "Mom, I'm sorry," David said without looking at me. I didn't realize how she was treating you. I wanted to be angry with him. I wanted to point out all the times he'd witnessed Jessica's behavior and said nothing. All the moments when he'd chosen the easy path instead of standing up for his mother. But looking at his slumped shoulders and the shame written across his face, I just felt tired. "Son," I said, putting my hand on his arm, "you can't unknow it now. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" He finally met my eyes, and I saw the boy I'd raised in there somewhere, underneath the exhaustion and conflict. "What do you want us to do?" It was a good question, and one I'd been asking myself for months without finding a clear answer. I loved my son. I adored my granddaughter, but living with Jessica's contempt was slowly killing something inside me, some essential part of my self-respect that I'd fought too hard to earn. "I want you to find your own place," I said finally. "I want you to take responsibility for your family instead of letting me do it. And I want Jessica to apologize for treating me like garbage in my own home." David nodded slowly. "That's fair. More than fair, actually. Give us 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. Take your time," I said, meaning it, "but things have to change starting now. I'm not your babysitter, your housekeeper, or your maid. I'm your mother, and I deserve better." That conversation happened on a Sunday night in October. By Thursday, everything had exploded. I woke up that morning to find Jessica in my kitchen. talking rapidly into her phone while Emma sat in her high chair eating Cheerios. Jessica's voice was high and agitated, and she was pacing back and forth between the counter and the sliding glass door. "No, Mom, you don't understand," she was saying. "She humiliated me in front of the entire family. She made me look like some kind of gold digger or something." A pause while her mother responded, "Of course I know whose house it is legally, but we've been living here for 3 years. We have rights." I stopped pretending to make coffee and listened more carefully. "I looked it up online," Jessica continued. "If you live somewhere long enough, you can claim it as your residence. Adverse possession, they call it. David doesn't know I'm looking into this, but I think we might have a case." Adverse possession. My daughter-in-law was literally researching ways to steal my house. Emma saw me standing in the doorway and squealed, "Gamma," with such joy that I couldn't help but smile despite the rage building in my chest. I picked her up from the high chair and kissed her chubby cheeks, breathing in that sweet baby smell that never failed to calm me down. Jessica spun around at the sound of Emma's voice and had the grace to look embarrassed. "I'll call you back later, Mom," she said into the phone, ending the call quickly. "Good morning, Jessica," I said politely, like I hadn't just heard her discussing how to legally steal my property. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," she said, avoiding my eyes. My mother was asking about the living situation. You know how mothers worry." "I do indeed," I replied, settling Emma back in her high chair and offering her a banana. "I worry about my son quite a bit lately." Jessica's face hardened. "David's fine. We both are. In fact, we've been talking, and we think it might be better if we stayed here a little longer, just until the market improves. You understand. Moving right now would be financially irresponsible." The audacity took my breath away. 4 days ago, she'd called me a maid at my own dinner table. Now she was informing me that she'd decided not to move out of my house because it wouldn't be convenient for her. "I see," I said carefully. "And what does David think about this change in plans?" "David agrees," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "We're a family, Margaret. Families support each other." There it was again. That manipulation disguised as sentiment, the implication that if I insisted they move out, I was the one breaking up the family, the suggestion that supporting them meant letting Jessica treat me however she wanted in my own home. "You're absolutely right," I said, smiling sweetly. "Families do support each other. They also respect each other." Jessica's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, David walked into the kitchen dressed for work. He kissed Emma's forehead, grabbed a coffee mug from the cabinet, and gave me a quick hug. "Morning, Mom," he said. "I've been thinking about our conversation Sunday night. I found a few rental listings online that might work for us. Want to take a look later?" The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Jessica's face went through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, a kind of cold determination I'd never seen before. "Actually, honey," Jessica said, sliding her arm through David's and leaning against him, "I've been doing some research too. I think we should talk to a lawyer before we make any big decisions about moving." David frowned. "A lawyer? Why would we need a lawyer?" "Tenant rights," Jessica said smoothly. "We've established residency here. We have legal protections that we should understand before we just pack up and leave." I watched my son's face as he processed this information. I could see him trying to work out what Jessica was really saying without actually saying it. The confusion, the growing realization, and finally, the horror as he understood that his wife was threatening legal action against his mother. "Jess," he said slowly, "we're not tenants. We're family staying here temporarily, out of my mother's kindness. We've been here 3 years." "David," Jessica said, her voice gaining strength, "we receive mail here. Emma's doctor's appointments list this as our address. This is our legal residence whether Margaret likes it or not." The kitchen went silent except for Emma's contented babbling as she squished banana between her fingers. I looked at my son, willing him to say something, to stand up to his wife, to choose his mother over this legal threat, disguised as a practical concern. David set down his coffee mug and ran his hands through his hair. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "This is all happening too fast." "There's nothing to think about," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "Jessica, you have 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live." That timeline just became non-negotiable. "You can't just kick us out," Jessica shot back. "We have a baby. I'll call social services. Tell them you're putting a child in danger by making us homeless. I'll tell them about your drinking." My drinking. I had a glass of wine with dinner maybe twice a week and a beer while watching baseball on Sundays. But I understood the threat. Jessica was prepared to lie to government agencies to keep living in my house rent. Jessica Marie, David said, and his voice had gone dangerously quiet. That is enough. Something in his tone must have warned her that she'd pushed too far because Jessica's combative posture deflated slightly. David, I'm just trying to protect our family by threatening my mother with false reports to social services. David picked up his coffee mug and dumped the contents down the drain. By researching ways to legally steal her house, by treating her like hired help at her own dinner table. I never. You called her a maid, David said, his voice rising, in front of our entire family. You called my mother a maid. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. I was upset about the wine. I didn't mean yes, you did, I said quietly. You meant every word, and we all know it. David looked back and forth between us, and I could see him trying to navigate between loyalty to his wife and respect for his mother. It was an impossible position, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I'm going to work, David said finally. When I come home tonight, I expect this situation to be resolved. Jessica, you will apologize to my mother, and we will start looking for our own place immediately. He kissed Emma goodbye, grabbed his keys, and left without another word. The sound of his car pulling out of the driveway seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Jessica and I stared at each other across my kitchen, my granddaughter blissfully unaware of the battle being waged around her high chair. Finally, Jessica spoke. You're going to lose him, she said, her voice steady and cold. You're going to push this too far, and David will choose his wife and daughter over his bitter old mother. Is your pride really worth losing your son? The words hit their intended target. Every insecurity I'd ever had about being a single mother, every worry about whether my children really loved me or just felt obligated to tolerate me, every fear about growing old alone. Jessica had found my weak spot and applied pressure with surgical precision, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated what 30 years of single motherhood had taught me about survival, about standing up for myself when no one else would, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Jessica, I said, lifting Emma out of her high chair and settling her on my hip, the only thing that could make me lose my son is continuing to enable his wife's disrespect. So let me make something very clear. You have 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. If you're not gone by November 1st, I'll start eviction proceedings. You can't evict family, Jessica said, but her confidence was wavering. Watch me, I replied, and I meant every word. That afternoon, I drove to the office of Gerald Michaels, the lawyer who'd handled my parents' estate and my divorce. Gerald was 73 years old, had been practicing law for 45 years, and had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from seeing every possible family drama play out in legal documents. Margaret, Gerald said, rising from behind his desk to give me a hug. It's been too long. How are you holding up? I settled into the leather chair across from his desk and got straight to the point. Gerald, I need to know my rights regarding my daughter, who's living in my house and now threatening to claim residency rights to avoid moving out. Gerald's eyebrows went up, but he just pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. How long has she been living there? 3 years. My son lost his job. She was pregnant. I offered them the guest wing temporarily. I explained the whole situation, from the initial invitation to Jessica's research into adverse possession, to her threat to call social services. Gerald listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on his pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled grimly. Margaret, the good news is that you have absolutely nothing to worry about legally. Oregon's adverse possession laws require hostile occupation of property, meaning the person has to be living there against the owner's wishes, since you invited them to stay, and there's no written lease agreement. They're considered licensees, not tenants. What does that mean practically? It means you can revoke their license to live in your house at any time with reasonable notice. 2 weeks is more than reasonable. Gerald made another note. The threat to call social services is harassment, and I can draft a letter making that very clear if needed. Relief flooded through me so intensely, I almost started crying right there in Gerald's office. So I can make them leave. You can absolutely make them leave. In fact, if they refuse, we can file for an unlawful detainer action and have them removed by the sheriff's department. Gerald set down his pen and looked at me seriously. Margaret, I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you look this stressed. What else is going on here? So I told him about becoming the living babysitter, about Jessica's escalating demands and diminishing respect, about feeling like a stranger in my own home. I told him about the dinner table incident and David's obvious discomfort with confronting his wife's behavior. My dear, Gerald said when I finished, you're describing emotional abuse, not from your son, but from his wife, and it's time to put a stop to it. Gerald drafted 2 letters that afternoon. The first was a formal notice to vacate, giving David and Jessica 30 days to move out of my property. The second was a cease and desist letter regarding Jessica's threats to make false reports to government agencies. Both letters were professional, legal, and absolutely bulletproof. Deliver these tonight when your son gets home from work, Gerald advised. Both of them need to understand that this situation has moved beyond family drama into legal territory. I drove home with the letters in my purse, feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a clear path forward that didn't require me to sacrifice my dignity or my peace of mind. Jessica was in the living room when I got back, Emma napping upstairs and soap operas playing on the television I paid for. She looked up when I walked in, and something in my expression must have warned her that things had shifted. "Did you have a nice afternoon?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Very productive, actually," I replied. "I'll be in my room if you need anything." That evening, David came home to find me cooking dinner like nothing had happened. Jessica was feeding Emma in the kitchen, and the atmosphere was superficially normal, except for the undercurrent of tension that had become our family's baseline. "How was work?" I asked David, kissing his cheek as he hung up his coat. "Fine," he said, studying my face carefully. "You seem different." "Better. I feel better," I said honestly. "I had a chance to think about our conversation this morning, and I've made some decisions." We ate dinner with careful politeness, discussing David's day at work and Emma's latest developments. She was trying to say daddy and had managed something that sounded like da, which delighted David and even made Jessica smile genuinely for the first time in days. After Emma was in bed, I asked David and Jessica to sit down at the kitchen table. I placed Gerald's letters in front of them like I was dealing cards. "These are legal documents," I said simply. "The first is a formal notice to vacate. You have 30 days to find other housing. The second is a cease and desist order regarding threats to make false reports to government agencies." David picked up the notice to vacate and read it twice before looking at me with a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Mom, you actually went to a lawyer." "I had to," I said. "This morning, Jessica researched adverse possession laws to see if she could claim ownership of my house. She threatened to call social services and lie about my drinking to prevent you from moving out." This stopped being a family matter and became a legal issue. Jessica grabbed the cease and desist letter and scanned it quickly, her face going pale. "This is insane. David, your mother is threatening to have us thrown out by the police." "No," David said slowly, still staring at the eviction notice. "My mother is protecting herself from threats and manipulation. And honestly, Jess, I don't blame her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jessica stared at her husband like he'd slapped her. "You're taking her side." "I'm not taking anyone's side," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm just trying to understand how we got here." "We got here," I said quietly, "because respect is a two-way street, and it's been a one-way street for too long." Jessica stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back. "I don't have to listen to this. I'm going upstairs." "Jessica," David called after her, but she was already halfway up the stairs. A few seconds later, we heard their bedroom door slam. David and I sat in silence for a long moment. The legal documents spread between us like evidence of a crime. Finally, he spoke. "Mom, I know I've let you down. I know I should have said something sooner about how she was treating you. Why didn't you?" David sighed and rubbed his face. "Because it was easier not to see it. Because confronting Jessica means dealing with conflict, and I hate conflict. Because I kept telling myself it was temporary, that things would get better once we moved out. And now I realized that enabling her behavior was just as bad as doing it myself." David folded the eviction notice and put it in his shirt pocket. "We'll be out before the 30 days are up, I promise." The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Jessica barely spoke to me, communicating only when absolutely necessary about Emma's needs or household logistics. She started looking at rental listings online with the kind of desperate intensity that might have made me feel sorry for her if I hadn't heard her researching ways to steal my house. David, to his credit, took the apartment hunting seriously. He called landlords, scheduled viewings, and even asked me to babysit Emma while he and Jessica looked at potential places. It felt strange to have him asking for favors instead of Jessica demanding them, but it was a change in the right direction. The first place they looked at was a 2-bedroom apartment in Beaverton, about 20 minutes from David's office. The rent was $1,800 a month, which shocked Jessica into a kind of stunned silence. She'd been living rent-free for so long that she'd forgotten what housing actually costs in Portland. $1,800, she kept repeating as they drove home from the viewing. For that tiny place with the broken dishwasher and the stained carpet. It's not that bad, David said, but he sounded discouraged too. And the landlord said they'd fix the dishwasher before we moved in. David, we can't afford $1,800 a month, plus utilities, plus groceries, plus daycare. The math doesn't work. She was right, and we all knew it. On David's salary, they'd be living paycheck to paycheck with no cushion for emergencies, but the alternative was staying in my house indefinitely while Jessica continued to treat me like hired help, and that was no longer an option. The second place was cheaper but in a rougher neighborhood, and Jessica rejected it immediately. The third was perfect but already rented to someone else. The fourth required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit up front, nearly $6,000 that they didn't have. 2 weeks into the apartment search, Jessica came into the kitchen where I was making Emma's lunch and sat down heavily at the table. "Margaret," she said, and her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in months. "I need to ask you something," I continued, spreading peanut butter on bread, waiting. "Would you consider lending us money for the security deposit and first month's rent? We found a place we really like, but we need about $4,000 up front." The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. Jessica was asking for help from the woman she'd called a maid 3 weeks earlier, and we both understood the irony. "Where's the apartment?" I asked. "Tigard, 2 bedrooms, washer and dryer hookups, small patio. It's in a good school district for when Emma gets older." Jessica's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the hope underneath. "What's the monthly rent?" $1,500 plus utilities, but that includes water and garbage." I finished making Emma's sandwich and cut it into small pieces she could manage with her fingers. The silence stretched on while I considered Jessica's request and what it would mean for all of us. "I'll lend you the money," I said finally, "but I want a written agreement with a payment schedule, and I want a sincere apology for how you've treated me." Jessica's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw past her defenses to the scared young mother underneath. "Margaret, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I know I've been awful to you, and I know you didn't deserve it. It wasn't the apology I'd been hoping for, but it was a start." "Why, Jessica? Help me understand what I did to make you hate me so much." She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't hate you. I was jealous of you." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "David talks about you like you're some kind of superhero. Margaret this, Margaret that. The way you raised 4 kids alone, the way you kept the family together after his father left, the way you made everyone feel loved and safe." I sat down across from her, Emma's lunch forgotten. "I wanted to be the woman David looked up to like that," Jessica continued, "but instead, I'm the woman who can't even take care of her own baby without help, who can't cook a decent meal or manage a household budget or any of the things you make look so easy." "Jessica, no, it's not an excuse," she said quickly. "I know being jealous doesn't justify treating you like garbage. But when I moved in here and saw how effortlessly you handled everything I struggled with, it made me feel so small and useless." For the first time since I'd known Jessica, I felt something like sympathy for her. She was 26 years old, had been married to my son for 4 years, and was trying to figure out how to be a wife and mother while living in the shadow of her husband's admiration for his own mother. "Being a mother is the hardest job in the world," I said gently, "and it doesn't come with a manual. Everything you think I do effortlessly took me years to learn, and I made plenty of mistakes along the way." Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "David never talks about your mistakes, only your triumphs. That's because he was a child when I was making most of my mistakes. And children don't usually remember their parents' failures. They remember feeling loved and safe, which is all that really matters." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the kitchen filled with the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Finally, Jessica spoke again. "I really am sorry, Margaret, about the maid comment. about researching adverse possession, about all of it. I was scared and angry and looking for someone to blame. And you were an easy target. Apology accepted, I said, and I meant it. But Jessica, we need to establish some boundaries going forward. You're my son's wife and my granddaughter's mother, which makes you family. But family doesn't mean you get to treat me with disrespect. I understand, Jessica said, and I promise things will be different. The apartment in Tigard was perfect for them. 2 bedrooms, updated kitchen, small backyard where Emma could play as she got older. The landlord was a retired teacher named Mrs. Chen, who took one look at Emma and started asking about childproofing the electrical outlets. I wrote the check for the security deposit and first month's rent, and David signed a promissory note agreeing to pay me back at $200 a month for 2 years. It wasn't about the money, really. It was about establishing that this was a loan between family members, not a gift that could be taken for granted. Moving day was on a Saturday in late November. My other children showed up with trucks and boxes, turning the whole thing into a family affair. Sarah brought homemade cookies for everyone, and Mark recruited 2 of his friends to help with the heavy furniture. Even Lisa came, despite having her own family commitments, because she wanted to support David and Jessica's new beginning. I watched from my front porch as they loaded David's desk, Jessica's dresser, Emma's crib, and 3 years' worth of accumulated belongings. It should have felt like loss, like my family was moving away and leaving me alone. Instead, it felt like healing, like everyone was finally in their proper place. Emma was confused by all the activity and kept reaching for me whenever someone tried to carry her away from the chaos. I spent most of the morning holding her, explaining in the simple words she could understand that Mommy and Daddy were moving to a new house, but Grandma would still be here whenever she wanted to visit. Gamma house, she asked, pointing at my front door. Gamma's house, I confirmed, and Emma's new house with Mommy and Daddy. As the last box was loaded into Mark's truck, David walked over to where I was sitting on the porch steps with Emma on my lap. Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion, thank you for everything. For taking us in when we needed help, for putting up with our dysfunction, for lending us the money to start over. You're my son, I said simply. This is what family does for each other. I know, but I also know we took advantage of your kindness, and I'm sorry for that. David sat down beside me on the step and wrapped his arm around my shoulders. For a moment, it felt like he was 12 years old again, coming to me with a scraped knee or a broken heart, trusting that I could fix whatever was wrong. I'm proud of you, I told him. It takes courage to admit when things aren't working and make changes. I learned from the best, David said, kissing my forehead the way I'd kissed his 1,000 times when he was small. Jessica appeared in the doorway, holding a small wrapped package. Margaret, I wanted to give you this before we left. Inside the wrapping paper was a framed photo of Emma and me, taken a few weeks earlier when I'd been reading her a story in my rocking chair. Emma was looking up at me with complete trust and adoration, and I was gazing down at her with the kind of love that transcends words. I know things got difficult between us, Jessica said, but I never want Emma to forget how much her grandmother loves her. And I never want you to forget how grateful I am that David had you for a mother. It made him the man I fell in love with. It was the most genuine thing Jessica had ever said to me, and it felt like a peace offering, a promise that we could build something better on the foundation of mutual respect. That evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I walked through the rooms that had been occupied by my son's family for 3 years. The guest wing felt strange without David's work clothes hanging in the closet, without Jessica's makeup scattered across the bathroom counter, without Emma's toys scattered across the floor. But it also felt peaceful in a way I'd almost forgotten. I could eat dinner at whatever time I wanted. I could watch the news without someone changing the channel. I could go to bed early or stay up late reading without worrying about disturbing anyone. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. The months that followed brought a new rhythm to our family relationships. David and Jessica invited me over for dinner every other Sunday, and I reciprocated on the alternate weeks. Emma stayed with me one Saturday a month, giving her parents a chance to reconnect as a couple while maintaining her bond with her grandmother. Jessica kept her promise about treating me with respect. She never again made demands disguised as requests, never spoke to me like hired help, never made me feel unwelcome in my own home. Instead, she asked for advice about parenting, complimented my cooking, and actually seemed to enjoy our conversations. More importantly, she started standing on her own as Emma's mother and David's wife. She learned to cook basic meals, managed their household budget, and took initiative in solving problems instead of expecting others to handle everything for her. David flourished in his role as head of his own household. Having to pay rent and utilities and groceries made him more conscious of money. But it also gave him pride in providing for his family independently. He got a promotion at work 6 months after they moved out, partly because he was more focused and confident. Emma adjusted to having 2 homes with the resilience that children seem to possess naturally. She called my house Gamma House and their apartment Home House, and she was equally comfortable in both places. Watching her grow and develop her own personality was one of my greatest joys. As for me, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of caretaking and conflict. I started taking watercolor classes at the community center, joined a book club at the library, and even began dating a kind widower named Robert, who shared my love of gardening and old movies. The house that had felt like a battleground became a sanctuary again. I could hear the echoes of my children's laughter in every room, but I could also imagine new memories being made with grandchildren and maybe even great-grandchildren someday. 6 months after David and Jessica moved out, I was in my kitchen making Sunday breakfast when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the window, I saw Jessica getting Emma out of her car seat, both of them dressed for church. "Surprise visit," I called out as they walked up to the front door. "Emergency visit," Jessica called back, but she was laughing. "Someone woke up at 5:30 asking for Gamma pancakes." Emma toddled into the kitchen like she owned the place, which in a way, she did. She was part of my heart, part of my legacy, part of the family I'd spent 30 years building and protecting. "Gamma," she squealed, wrapping her arms around my legs. "Pancakes, pancakes it is," I said, lifting her up for a proper hug, "but only if you help me crack the eggs." As Jessica and I worked together to make breakfast, Emma helping by stirring the batter with intense concentration, I reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The kitchen still smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. The morning light still streamed through the windows in the same golden pattern. Emma still got flour on her nose and maple syrup on her fingers, but the tension was gone. The resentment was gone. The feeling of being a stranger in my own home was gone. What remained was family. Complicated, imperfect, sometimes frustrating family, but family nonetheless. The kind of family where people make mistakes and apologize and do better next time. The kind of family where boundaries are respected and love is expressed through actions as well as words. "Margaret," Jessica said as we sat down to eat, Emma in her old high chair chattering about the pancakes shaped like butterflies. "I've been thinking about something you said the night I apologized." "What's that?" "You said that family doesn't mean you get to treat people with disrespect. I think that's the most important thing anyone's ever taught me about relationships." I squeezed Jessica's hand across the table, watching Emma destroy a perfectly good butterfly pancake with the kind of systematic thoroughness that only toddlers can achieve. "It took me a long time to learn that lesson myself," I said, "but once you understand that love without respect isn't really love at all, everything else falls into place." And that, I think, is the real story here. Not about property ownership or legal threats or family drama, although those things all played their part. The real story is about learning when to stand up for yourself, when to set boundaries, and when to hold the people you love accountable for their behavior. I could have let Jessica continue treating me like hired help in my own home. I could have kept enabling the dysfunction to avoid conflict. I could have sacrificed my dignity to keep my son and granddaughter close, but I didn't. And that made all the difference. So if you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in any part of it, let me ask you something. If someone in your family was treating you the way Jessica treated me, what would you do? Would you speak up, or would you stay silent to keep the peace? Because here's what I learned. Keeping the peace isn't always peaceful. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable behavior. Sometimes setting boundaries is what saves relationships instead of ending them. If someone you love is dealing with a situation like mine, share this story with them. Let them know that standing up for yourself doesn't make you the villain in your own family's story. It makes you someone who understands their worth. And if you're the person doing the disrespecting, like Jessica was, understand that the people who love you want to keep loving you, but they need you to meet them halfway with basic human decency. I'm still here in my house on Maple Street, the house I paid for and own, and will pass down to my children someday. Emma is 3 now and calls me every Tuesday evening to tell me about her day in the kind of detail only preschoolers can provide. David got another promotion and bought Jessica a small diamond ring for their 5th wedding anniversary. Jessica sent me a Mother's Day card last year that made me cry in the best possible way. We're all exactly where we belong in our own spaces, respecting each other's boundaries, choosing love over convenience and dignity over dysfunction. And isn't that what family is supposed to be about? Drop a comment below and let me know what you would have done in my situation. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. And subscribe for more real-life stories about family, relationships, and finding your voice when it matters most. Thanks for listening, wherever you are in the world right now. This is Margaret, signing off from Portland, Oregon, reminding you that your home should always feel like home to you first.